Welcome, everyone. It's so nice to see so many people joining us here today. And I know we're going to have some more people joining us over the next minute or two, but I want to dive right in and give a very quick overview of Energy Action Network, who's hosting this webinar. So, welcome to our webinar on putting thermal networks to work. I'm Kara Robacek from Energy Action Network. And for those of you who don't know, EAN is a diverse network of over 200 nonprofits, businesses, utilities, public agencies, and other organizations working together to achieve Vermont's climate and energy commitments in ways that create a more just, thriving, and sustainable future for Vermonters. In addition, EAN has a small but committed staff that has two main roles. We compile and share data and analysis about Vermont's progress towards our climate and energy commitments. And we also convene the EAN network, including network action teams working on specific issues. I'm happy to be here today with you on behalf of the Networked Thermal Network Action Team. And before I hand over to our speakers, I want to remind you of just a couple of logistics. So please keep yourself on mute as our presenters are speaking, because we've set this up as a meeting so that we can all see each other. But please feel free to add your questions to the chat box on Zoom as they occur to you, and we will bring those into the conversation as it progresses over the next hour or so. And with that brief introduction, I'm pleased to turn this all over to Debbie New, who co-chairs the EAN Network Thermal team, and who is also the founder of the Vermont Community Geothermal Alliance. Welcome, Debbie.
Thank you. And I'm glad to see some people putting their name and where they're zooming in from in the chat. Please, everybody, feel free to do that. It'd be great to see the spread across Vermont and maybe beyond that we have here. I'm really glad to be here with you today. This is the second webinar in a 3-webinar series with one more session coming soon, and you can register for that April 4th webinar in a link that will show up in the chat. I hope you can join us for that last one. But today, I am excited for us to talk with Jay Egg, founder of EggGeo, a worldwide thermal exchange engineering and consulting group. We'll hear about how thermal energy networks are taking off, thanks in big part to Jay's work. Then we'll talk not only about how Vermont can use thermal energy networks to reduce our emissions and achieve our climate goals, but also how this solution can help us do that more equitably. I'm going to start briefly with the basics, and then Jay will show us what's happening globally and just across the lake in New York, where they passed a game-changing bill last year. And we have a bill in Vermont, H242, that is based on that bill, but also tailored to Vermont. So after those brief presentations, we'll talk together. So as Kara said, please put your questions in the chat, and we'll get to as many of them as we can. I know that I have questions for Jay. So first, I want to share my screen and make sure you can see my slides, because I'm going to talk about what the term thermal energy networks means. So thermal obviously refers to heating, which we need a lot of in Vermont, but it also encompasses cooling, which we will need more and more as the climate warms. The kind of energy we're talking about here is geothermal from the ground, but it's also about capturing waste heat and energy from wastewater. And we're going to talk a lot more about that. These networks that we're talking about are closed loops of pipes underground that are designed to exchange temperature between buildings and between the ground among buildings. And the idea here is to balance thermal loads. So today we're not looking at deep geothermal, like for power plants. Some people refer to it as hot rocks geothermal. And we're not looking at district steam from biomass or combustion-based systems. We're talking about mainly water in relatively shallow pipes carrying temperature between the ground and buildings and among buildings. And what you see here is a relatively large pipe and part of a geothermal loop in a large building in Burlington, Vermont, because we do have some geothermal in the state, but not so many networks. So next slide. Let's just look at geothermal for a single home. You're probably familiar with it. So briefly, when you turn on your heat, the ground source heat pump inside your home delivers warm air and extracts cold air, like an air source heat pump. And when you need cooling, the process reverses. That same heat pump delivers cold air and extracts heat, returning it to the earth where it's stored. So this energy comes from underground, where the Earth's ambient temperature is a constant 50 to 55 degrees. Water-filled pipes bring that temperature to your heat pump, where it's concentrated into hot or cold air as needed. A network system can be more efficient and get the benefits of this cleanest heating and cooling solution to more people. For example, in a town center like this one, that looks a little bit like some downtowns in Vermont, the buildings can be connected to vertical bores that are linked by horizontal pipes, forming these closed loops that exchange temperature with the earth and share between buildings. So excess heating and cooling isn't wasted. It can be exchanged efficiently between them. Now, all of this gets eye-opening and really exciting when we include the world of waste heat and wastewater as other sources of thermal energy, which is why I'm grateful for the chance for us to talk with Jay Egg, who not only literally wrote the book on geothermal, but also leads EggGeo, a group of experts who travel the world to help design, implement, and scale thermal exchange, including recently meeting with US Energy Secretary Granholm to keep her up to speed on the power of thermal networks. Jay is not only an advocate, you could say an evangelist for thermal networks, he's also a great translator of technical information and a generous teacher. So Jay, over to you.
Thank you so much, Debbie. I really appreciate it. I am going to share my screen now and talk to everybody a little bit about what we're doing, focusing a little bit on Vermont. I want to start with this image here and just point out that this image was created 10 years ago when the legislators in New York City, the city council, wanted to understand how in the world they were going to take 900,000 out of their 1.1 million buildings and convert them over to heat pumps. One of the things they realized, just like Debbie was talking about and Vermont realizes, is that air source heat pumps are definitely a part of the solution, but in order to manage responsibly the electrification and decarbonization of the grid, you have to take it on authority that, and I'll prove it out here with a couple of graphs a little later, but there's a problem, and maybe you've heard about it nationally and worldwide as we electrify urban settings, cities, states, countries. As we electrify, we're taking buildings that were heated by combustion heating in the wintertime, and we're heating them with some form of electric heat. There's a couple of different types that we'll talk about in a couple of minutes, but I'm going to point out first, just like in Debbie's picture here that was created by Ellie from their team, this shows how we can take excess energy from cooling dominant buildings in the middle of the winter. Instead of sending the energy out through cooling towers, we divert that energy. And this is not just a good idea. This is something that's been in practice for 50 years now. Stockholm, Sweden has had a thermal energy network similar to this since before the 80s. So what we found out in studying urban settings is that there is almost always, especially in this new age, with lots of data centers popping up and office buildings and other heat creating opportunities, these buildings are exhausting heat in the middle of the winter while the apartments and heating dominant buildings need that energy. So we proved out in practice many times how we can turn off the cooling towers, divert that energy to a thermal energy network that can share energy between all of the buildings. Now, the reason we have here a subway, and the reason we have surface water exchange with using these lake plates and other surface water exchangers is because this is all part of the solution. There are about 25 really solid different ways to exchange energy with existing infrastructure. And that's part of the reason this is called a thermal energy network, not a geothermal energy network, because we do use geothermal transfer, but a lot of the energy comes from existing infrastructure like wastewater. For example, 40% of the energy that we need to heat our buildings, including domestic hot water, goes straight down the drain. We've proven out in practice that you can extract that energy before it hits the main sewer or even at the wastewater effluent plants. In addition to that, we can use structural piles. Part of the building construction can be heat transfer for the buildings. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about all that, but I promised Debbie I would go into a little bit of the history of EggGeo just for about 30 seconds. We started out in Central Florida. I was a US Navy nuclear power engineer and got out in the late 80s and immediately realized there was a better way to do heating and cooling. And so worked with a lot of the industry giants, the national labs, and we were able to get quite a bit of traction for the industry early on. But that was well before the US even recognized geothermal heat pumps as something eligible for federal tax credits, which came about in around 2009 under Obama. A little bit further back in the history, you can see my grandfather was in the same trade I am in back in, and you can see this is from 1948, an energy bill. Just gives you an idea how deep the roots go. So in our case, we have a large family, and our family has grown up around the contracting business. These are a lot of our children. This is one of the books we wrote for McGraw-Hill. And we have continued, and this is Christy with Secretary Granholm just 2 weeks ago in Texas, got to spend some time explaining to her how thermal energy networks are integrating and making a huge difference in the infrastructure. We're also involved in children's educational materials as well as graduate level educational materials. So as we move forward, I'm going to start with this image here. It's just another way of showing the other two images. The difference is in most of our city centers now, we have some type of data centers, and sometimes they might be hidden. They might be under a different name than just a data center, like for Facebook or Google. And that's part of the reason that that when we do city thermal energy networks, we have to do what's called a GIS analysis, thermal analysis on the city. And we're able to identify which of the buildings are cooling dominant, like a data center, and which are heating dominant, needing heat, like these residential and multifamily. And much like an electrical grid that has solar panels that are putting energy into the grid, meanwhile people are pulling energy out, that's what this is. This is not an electric grid though. This is a thermal energy grid. There's an electrical energy grid which uses wires, and now the US is in city centers throughout the US, including Vermont, we're adding thermal energy networks, which are utility infrastructure projects. And the reason why is most of the energy consumed in our buildings is used for cooling, heating, and domestic hot water. So the reason, and before we go into that, too much of that, I want to point out, and I'm going to spend about 5 or 10 more minutes on this before I turn it back to Debbie, and we have a lot more educational slides we can share as questions come up. But I want to explain that a thermal energy network is designed to provide thermal energy to air conditioning and heating. And in a network, the devices that extract and reject heating to the network are heat pumps. Now, just so everybody recognizes it, this is a standard garden variety Carrier heat pump. Everybody is used to seeing these outside. What's different with a geothermal system is that you can see it in this illustration here. Instead of having an outside condenser, it's got outside pipes that are hidden underground that are communicating with 55-degree earth temperature rather than in the wintertime sub-freezing temperatures, and in the summertime 95, 100, 105-degree temperatures. So it's not hard to see why the geothermal heat pump is not only going to operate more efficiently, i.e. 55-degree thermal energy source is much more abundant heat than 10 degrees or 15 degrees or 20 degrees outside. And every one of these heat pumps, no matter what you use, whether it's a window shaker, a split system, or a central rooftop unit, they use what's called the Carnot refrigeration cycle. And that simply means it's using a refrigeration compressor. Just like your refrigerator in your kitchen, people find it illogical how you can use the temperature of the kitchen, which is 72 degrees, and a compressor or a Carnot refrigeration cycle can make the box of your refrigerator 40 degrees. It does that by compressing the heat, and you feel that in warmth on your feet when you go into the kitchen at night. It's pumping the heat out of the box and it's pumping up to a higher temperature. That's the same way an air conditioner works. It pumps heat out of the building to an outside condenser, and it rejects the heat to the outside air. When you're doing this and you need to bring heat into the building, there's two ways to electrify a building. You can either do it using electric resistance heating, like everybody's used to seeing a space heater. In that case, 1 kilowatt of electricity will get you 3,412 BTUs of heat. And that is what it is. However, a heat pump, a geothermal heat pump with that same kilowatt of electricity is going to use it because it's, get this, this is the key. A heat pump is a little bit like a water pump. If you buy a water pump, you're not going to plug it in and expect it to spontaneously make water, right? You're going to need to put it into the water so it can pump it from the ground to provide water for your home. Well, the same thing is true with a heat pump. It pumps heat from wherever you've designed it to pump heat from. And a geothermal heat pump uses 1 unit of electricity to pump 4 units of heat from the ground, giving a grand total of, for 1 kilowatt, not 3,412 BTUs, rather 17,000 BTUs. So what you end up doing with the geothermal heat pump is when it's the coldest, when you need the heat the most and it's well below freezing outside, and a regular air source heat pump is running very inefficiently, you will find that the geothermal heat pump is operating as efficiently as if it was 55 degrees outside. This was proven out at the ASHRAE headquarters in 2010 in Atlanta, Georgia, and has been proven out dozens of other times in other peer-reviewed white papers. But this is an actual situation where on purpose, they did identical type things on the first floor and on the second floor. On the first floor, they put the best VRF air source equipment they could get in 2010. And on the second floor, they put the geothermal heat pump solution. And as you can see in blue, the geothermal heat pumps are operating using less electricity than the air source heat pumps. That's a no-brainer. If it's hotter outside in the summer and colder outside in the winter than the ground, of course it's going to be more efficient. You're cheating otherwise if you say anything else, because the geothermal heat pump is using the 60, in this case in Atlanta, it's 60 or 65 degrees. So here's the real key. Here's why governments around the world are subscribing to the thermal energy network solution. When you need heat the most in October, November, December, January, February, the geothermal heat pump actually is operating lower energy consumption than it was in the middle of the summer. So what does that mean in a big picture? If your electric grid is used to handling summer peaks, it is also going to be able to handle the winter peak for the same building if you're using a geothermal solution. But if you're using an air source solution, the grid isn't going to be able to handle it. It's going to crash the grid, kind of like we've heard stories of rolling blackouts and difficulties when we have cold snaps in Texas and other things. That's exactly what's going to happen. Another example from Oklahoma, this is the winter time in these two identical buildings. You can see the green geothermal building operating very level. Meanwhile, in January and February, the air source building right next to it, this was two identical office buildings in Oklahoma, is spiking out of control, which is why we end up with grid problems. So there's more reasons than even that, but I'm going to say something. We're going to cover a couple of those over the next few minutes, but I'm going to say something that is just important to be taken on authority. If a government spends $1 on thermal energy networks, they will save about $3 on electrical infrastructure upgrades. So in other words, for $1 billion in government subsidies for a geothermal energy network, you're going to save $3 billion in electrical upgrades. And that's been proven out in many different pockets, especially in the Northeast. So another benefit that we want to focus on with thermal energy networks is it stops the reckless electrification of buildings using air source heat pumps. And when I say reckless, this is a New York apartment building. And yes, you can see they've added all of these different and various air source heat pumps here. But the fact of the matter is, they get old, they drop condensation, they freeze, and they become a mess, and they're very hard to work on, kind of like you see in buildings like this. And this is a building after a hurricane. That's why all these are toppled around like blocks. And this is just basically the wholesale in a third world country, a wholesale implementation of electrification. And what it does is it's not a really good way to do things, because these pieces of equipment are not only not energy efficient, but they tend to be dangerous and messy outside of buildings. Recently, and I'll share this with Debbie afterwards, but recently Standard & Poor's Market Intelligence did a report on efforts to develop centralized community geothermal heat pumps, because energy utilities, state and local governments are getting into this business in a very big way. We have electrical energy distribution. Now thermal energy distribution is the next big thing. Similar to what you're doing planning to do in Vermont, this is what NYSERDA has, as New York State Energy Research and Development Authority have, as an example of strategic implementation of these systems using this thermal energy network pipe that's subterranean, of course, and the brown or the beige cooling towers and air source heat pumps end up getting removed and replaced and tied into the thermal energy network. And that increases the sustainability and the longevity of equipment, because instead of being outside where it can be damaged by weather, it is now pulled inside, where not only is it safe from the weather, but it's also been proven to last 2.5 times longer. So not only have you got a permanent infrastructure network, now your equipment is lasting 2 to 3 times longer than existing systems. So a good example of why this works so well is this one. And I'm going to kind of wind down after this so we have time for some questions. This was 15 22-story buildings in the middle of Manhattan, right near Penn Station. This is called the Penn South Cooperative Complex. There are 2,500 families living here on 5 blocks. And NYSERDA tasked us as part of their Public Opportunity Notice 4614 to figure out how in this orange building, which is the central distribution plant, they have a 4 megawatt boiler that uses natural gas that creates the heat energy needed to heat these 2,500 apartments. They said, how can we turn off that boiler with the least invasive method possible? Well, our scientists and engineers studied it, and they found in this case, and there was always going to be something else that will work for a different situation, but in this case, right across the street, the US Postal Service, they found, was rejecting 8 megawatts of thermal energy constantly from their data centers and equipment. So we proved out scientifically that if we can turn off these cooling towers and divert that hydronic energy into this central energy plant here, we can turn off that boiler and save that 4 megawatts of combustion emissions. And they said, go ahead, that sounds like a great idea. So they funded the project. Much like that, there are a lot of other projects like the Cornell Bloomberg campus on Roosevelt Island that has a geothermal system, like Cornell in Ithaca has this central geothermal system which communicates with their lake. It is simply a matter of looking at, and this is another project in New York, looking at what public and private infrastructure projects can be pulled together. And that basically finishes my presentation. I have lots more to share, so ask any questions you want, but I want to turn the time back over to Debbie and make sure we leave enough time for any questions or comments, and then we'll pick it back up as needed. You're still muted, Debbie.
Yep, got it. Thanks. So maybe we can leave it in screen share in case you have some other slides you want to pull up as we talk.
You bet. I'm ready.
Okay, great. So one thing I love about the New York apartment buildings getting heat from the US Postal Service is that who knew that the USPS was going to help us decarbonize our buildings?
Right.
Yeah, so that's one reason why I asked you to talk about that. Obviously, we are not New York City, and we are not as heavily populated as New York State with as many cities as they have. So I do want to talk about the specifics of Vermont. But first, I keep getting questions about how thermal networks are going to help us reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, like how much? And so I'm hearing 80%, I'm hearing potentially 100% if they're paired with solar. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that.
Well, I sure can. I sure can, Debbie. So it's been proven scientifically and published on NYSERDA's website as well as the DOE's website. On average, nationally, about 4, and this is why it's so important. There's a great slide where there's an elephant in the room and you've got people talking about, well, I've got EV starting stations and I've got solar and I've got wind. Well, the fact of the matter is buildings emit, and it depends on where you are, 40 to 60%. And so they're either the first or second source, depending on where you are in the country, of carbon emissions. So by decarbonizing these buildings like we were talking about here, or wherever it is in Vermont, by decarbonizing these buildings, we are doing the rest of the work, which a lot of times it's the first line of decarbonization. It's going to do the most good. And a lot of times it's right after the transportation network. So it's somewhere between 40 and 60%, Debbie.
Okay, that's a helpful baseline. And then if you add solar and other things on top of that, you can do even
more. Decarbonize everything. Yeah.
Right. Great. Okay. So you helped us understand how thermal networks compare to air source heat pumps. And you talked a little bit about how they can help us protect essentially the electric grid. Is that a fair way to talk about it?
It is. It is. That, and if you want me to, would you like me to expand on that just a little bit?
Yeah, that would be great.
All right. So one of the best studies on this was done by Ontario. Ontario did a study. I'm just looking to see if I have it at my fingertips, and I don't think I do. So I'll just talk about it because it's sometimes better to do that. Ontario did a study of the entire province, which, by the way, Ontario has the population of about New Jersey. That's about 8-9 million. So Ontario, Canada, and it's a good study because it's Northeast, obviously. It's colder, if anything. They did a study and it looked at this. It said, either we can decarbonize our entire province using air source heat pumps and increase the grid capacity to handle all of that electric load in the winter, or we can subsidize geothermal energy networks or geothermal systems throughout the province and upgrade the electrical grid accordingly. And this is what it came out to, and I'm going to use actual numbers. They determined to subsidize full air source decarbonization, they would spend about $500 million on air source heat pumps, but it would cost $1.3 trillion to upgrade the electric grid to handle those. But if they did all geothermal, the upgrade over the next 30 years to the electrical grid would only be $500 billion. So they would end up saving well over $500 billion, $500 billion by just going with the better solution to begin with, the infrastructure of a thermal energy network. And the DOE, we're on a task force with the US Geological Survey called the Worldwide City Scale Geothermal Project. And so we're in the process of proving this out scientifically worldwide in different cities. So we're taking that to the next level, but make no mistake about it. It's about $1. If for every dollar they put into thermal energy networks, they save $2 to $3 on the electric grid in everywhere that has what we call a remarkable winter. In other words, that's north of the Mason-Dixon line, which surely you are. So south of the Mason-Dixon line, it's up to individual studies. So I won't cover any more on that, except to say that in Florida, for example, even though we have a lot of thermal energy networks, they're not nearly as necessary as they are in the Northeast, in any of the northern tier.
Thank you. And I do want to get to Vermont specific questions, but I think there's still more to talk about first about these networks as potentially an equitable climate solution. This is obviously big infrastructure to install, whether it's new construction or retrofit or both.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's a significant amount of upfront cost, but once these systems are installed, the energy bills can be quite affordable. And I'm wondering if you have an example, a story about where a network like this has been installed to benefit the people who can least afford to make the energy transition.
Oh, that's a wonderful example. Let me jump to another PowerPoint that I thought might be helpful. This is actually the PowerPoint we used for, I'm going to change this a little bit, for what we call the hot wash of the Thermal Energy Networks and Jobs Act in New York. And they were asking exactly that thing. What has actually been done that can prove out the savings of a thermal energy network? And some of the examples are like this. This is West Union, Iowa, where Merlin Dunt, who was the mayor from 1998 to 2011, said, as long as we're tearing up the streets and sidewalks to put in new water mains, we might as well improve energy infrastructure at the same time. And from that came the downtown thermal energy loop that they put in at the same time and stubbed these geothermal lines into each building. Now, in that case, and every case that we have studied so far, the energy bills, the energy outlay for, now you have to consider it this way. Previous to decarbonizing, you're paying a gas bill either for propane or natural gas or oil, and you're paying an electric bill to air condition. When you combine those two and go to an all-electric bill, the reduction is between 40 and 60% of what you're paying presently for heating and cooling and hot water. So going onto a thermal energy network typically reduces your overall cash outlay for energy by 40% on the conservative side, 60% on a higher end side. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. Could you talk a bit about where the upfront capital can come from for these projects?
Yes.
Because if we can access that, we could actually implement them not only in Vermont, but in a lot of places.
Yes, I will definitely talk about that. So there are 2 or 3 different ways to get the capital for this. And we're going through this. We had a meeting just before this with a co-op president in New York who is looking at, and in this case, it's a $250 million investment for this thermal energy network for this downtown area. So Con Ed wants to fund that, meaning the electric company can fund it, the electric or gas company. And as you're probably familiar with, in Massachusetts, the energy company, Eversource and National Grid, are funding different and various loops for test and pilot projects. The same thing is happening in New York. They're funding thermal energy networks, which is the why we have the Thermal Energy Networks and Jobs Act, because it directed the Public Service Commission to direct the electric companies to put in a certain number of thermal energy networks so that they can get it done. Now, in the case of the one we met with this morning, they weren't selected by Con Ed to be funded by the Public Service Commission. So you might think, oh, well, they're out of luck. There's no way they're going to get funded. Not so. Throughout the US, there are a dozen really reputable energy service companies. Now, if you don't know what that is, an energy service company is a company that's an infrastructure level provider of energy. And they don't care. There might be the same company that puts in a huge solar array or a huge wind farm or something. These companies, and that's very, very much in line with that Standard & Poor's investment advice slide, these companies have seen and identified thermal energy networks as a worthy investment. And the biggest problem we have as a proponent of these is every time we get a new project, we have 10 funders begging us to let them talk to Vermont or whoever we're dealing with and say, can we please do this? They don't care how much it is, because they're an energy company that only needs to get their money back over the next 40 to 60 years. And then after that, it's perpetual income. So what happens is most cities or communities will either get the local electric company, the local gas company, or they can choose to do their own thermal energy network, just like a lot of communities and municipalities have their own water network, and they charge for their water and sewer locally. They don't pay Con Ed or something like that for it. That's the same kind of thing that happens here. The city would own, and it kind of matches up with this picture right here, the city would own the thermal energy network, and they would charge for energy coming into and out of buildings. And it would be, but they would be, unless the city has a pot of money sitting around, they would be doing that in cooperation with this energy service company. And this energy service company would come on as a partner with the city or the community and say, yeah, we'll pay the tens of millions or whatever, or whatever it ends up costing. I don't know how big the project will be, but it might be 1 million, it might be 100 million, it might be $250 million. They will fund this after they prove it out and do their feasibility study with us, and they will put in this energy network, and then they will typically they hold the lease as long as they need to, and then they just give it back to the city. That's how PPAs and ESCOs work. So even though a lot of people on the call might not be familiar with it, that's how typically the city will buy a bond or get an approval and fund one and okay the ESCO to move forward with this. And then it's just a matter of getting the thing in.
That's great. So the New York bill that passed last year, I think you were involved in developing that, and
Yes.
maybe also in implementing that. Can you tell us a bit about that? Because that's about requiring utilities to make these projects happen. And we have a slightly different approach that we're presenting in Vermont, but it would be great to hear first about how the New York bill happened and what it does.
You betcha. So what we did in New York, and it's worth doing a little bit of backstory. It all started in 2017. I started working heavily with NYSERDA after they formed the Clean Heating and Cooling Division. So EggGeo got involved. And one of the first things we ran into when we were traveling around the state educating people, like you're going to be doing in Vermont, you're going to be traveling around educating folks with full day, multi-hour seminars and presentations. We were doing this in New York, and we ran into this situation where we found that the Empire State Plaza, the state capitol, was planning to put $88 million into a new combustion facility. So they had said that it was impossible to do geothermal. Well, we got involved and proved out that it was possible. It completely scrapped the $88 million project, and they've begun electrifying the plaza. That got the attention. Actually, what happened was EggGeo won a policy prize, a policy change prize through an academic organization, and that got the attention. And this is that Constellation Prize. This is the other engineer that worked with me on that. And that brought this gentleman, John Murphy, who's the national business manager for the pipe trades. It got his attention, and he called me. He says, "Jay, this might be a solution for our pipe trades. We couldn't figure out how we were going to make the transition." So the pipe trades, which represent millions of people nationally and hundreds of thousands just in New York, said, "Yes, show us some of these projects you're working on." And so we traveled around, and they flew us to Chicago to explain this to their trainers, how this would work. They got several legislators nationally on board. And so what happened was they toured a couple of plants we were working on, met with NYSERDA. This is all of these union business managers meeting with NYSERDA. And this was February 22nd of 2022. This just shows how much traction the unions brought, because by July 5th, it had already passed Assembly, it had already passed the Senate, and by July 5th, Governor Hochul was signing, and here she is signing the Thermal Energy Networks and Jobs Act in July 5th in New York City. And it was so blindingly fast, and that's the policy or the law, the New York State Thermal Energy Networks and Jobs Act, that required every utility in New York, every electric and gas utility in New York, to do several pilot projects with thermal energy networks.
That's great. So it really was a whole coalition of people making it happen. And
absolutely. Oh, I got to say, I just mentioned the unions. I'm sorry. Jessica Agelet, Lisa Dix, the Decarbonization Coalition, so many of what people consider green movements are now mainline, actually getting funded by the state, just like probably you are, to share the good news of thermal energy networks. So it wasn't just the unions, it was the unions getting along with the decarbonization coalitions, and they came to the legislature, and suddenly, and Christy and I were just week before last, we were on the union's dime again at the legislature, as the unions were asking us to present how they could convert several of the universities to geothermal. So and Lisa Dix and Jessica Agelet and the whole group was involved in that whole thing 2 weeks ago. So they are front and center. It wouldn't have happened without the coalition effort.
Right. So you've got, over in New York, you've got utilities, unions, and climate advocates.
Yes.
That made this happen and are working together to implement it.
I would have never imagined folks like, and this is, by the way, John Murphy, where is he? He's right there. That's the union boss right there. And Jessica's in here. I'm not, Lisa's in here somewhere, but I can't see her right now. She's probably hidden. But the point is, they're all working together. I would have never thought these folks would see eye to eye, yet we have a great coalition coming together, and that's what we need to continue.
That's amazing. And that's what we're trying to build in Vermont as well. We have a bill that is slightly different, although it is modeled on the New York bill. It's H242, and it doesn't require utilities to do these projects. Our one gas company, Vermont Gas Systems, VGS, is already looking into doing this. But what it does is it allows people, groups, entities that are not utilities to apply to become utilities in order to access the upfront costs that are required to install the infrastructure and be able to recoup that investment over time through rates. So, but what the Vermont bill does is it allows these projects to happen through utilities and through other organizations, say a business like a fuel dealer company or a solar company that wants to evolve its business and expand, a homeowners association, a municipality. So because we are not as urban as other states and without as many gas companies as other states, we need to have a different model for trying to get thermal networks into our more rural state.
Absolutely. I just put something in the chat, which is the unions were so excited about this after our Chicago visit last year and the February 22nd thing. They professionally created the video that I just put in the chat. It's under KE because I'm on Christie's apparently. But my point is, if you click that, it's a 5-minute video. It is so flippin' exciting because you see these rough and burly union guys who used to pipe natural gas and steam and everything. And they're like, where they were fighting this tooth and nail because they go, where are our jobs going? We work on boilers, we work on natural gas pipelines. Now they're excited going, oh my goodness, we get to pipe, put these new piping networks in. So we really have a strong advocate. As we know, the Biden administration and everybody down, they want to keep the unions happy too, because those are our workers, those are our citizens.
Absolutely.
So, yeah.
Yeah, so the New York story is really inspiring, and it will look different here, obviously. And I've been following some of the questions in the chat that have to do with Vermont specifically, and I'd love to use the remaining time to talk about what's possible in Vermont with you, given what you know about what's happening elsewhere and what you've learned. So I wonder, Cara, are there some questions from the chat that you think we should address if we're talking about Vermont specific questions?
Yeah, sure. I mean, there's some questions about what this might look like as you're trying to get this into communities. So for example, a question about when is the best time to get a town involved in geothermal? For instance, if there's a wastewater treatment plant upgrade coming, how can we start this conversation? I thought that was a really good question. Also paired with a different question, does the network have to be built all at once or can it be added to over time?
Oh, I love those. It's like, I almost believe that some of the askers of this question probably know that the work that HEAT has done in Massachusetts shows, and this is right from HEAT, give them full credit, they showed how the natural gas pipeline for these mixed use communities could be pared back, kind of like pruning a tree back, but they would do one street at a time and put it on a thermal energy network. And eventually this thermal energy network would end up taking over the whole city. And it can be done very gradually. You start back and you start replacing the leaky natural gas network. And that's exactly what they're doing with Eversource and National Grid right now in Massachusetts.
That's
and
great.
So, by the way, I should say one other thing. This one right over here, where you see them, if you have an infrastructure project already, my goodness, talk about the best time to do it. It really is, because if you got to tear up the street for new water lines or sewer lines, it doesn't take much more to put in. These are essentially, when you think about thermal energy networks, they're almost exactly like a water main for all intents and purposes. That's what they look like.
Great. And I do see the question we just got in the chat about the Borough-Happold study. If you go to heat.org, they've got a whole section on geothermal, and the feasibility study is right there.
Yep. It's a 50-page study, so easy to read. And it is, hats off to Zainab and Audrey and the whole team there. It got the attention and the traction. It was like we were, and you know what's funny, Zainab and Audrey say, oh, we were ahead, now New York's ahead. You know, it's like we're all doing the same thing though. We're all on the same team, but it is moving forward. And this is another this is an example of doing one street. Just kind of shows they only have to do a few houses at a time, because you don't need a fuel source per se. You can use local energy in the ground to do these little branches.
And some people are concerned about Vermont geography and geology. We've got rocky, often steep terrain. We've got a colder climate. And if we're so heat dominant, if we're pulling temperature out of the ground so much, maybe we would even deplete the heat that's right under our feet. So is it possible that tapping into other thermal sources can help us with that? We do less drilling, we have more thermal energy from other places besides just the ground.
It's interesting, and part of the Burrow-Happold study shows this. If you're in low density residential, 81% of the year is going to be spent on, or of your energy is spent on heating. Where if you're in high density mixed use, it's almost perfectly matched. So the question is, are we going to deplete the thermal capacity of the earth? The answer is a resounding no. I have been in this industry as an engineer for 33 years, and for 40 years, EggGeo has been operating. The science of properly extracting low-grade thermal energy from the earth is perfect. And there are logarithms or formulas that show, if you think about the earth as a mass, you can realize it's obviously impossible for us to deplete that, but we're worried about that local area. Are we going to deplete all the energy? Well, there's a certain amount of, if you deplete the energy and you stop depleting it, heat will come in because of conductivity. It's just like putting a coffee cup on the table. It's going to assume room temperature. Everything is going to assume this enthalpy. And so what we do as engineers is we have definite formulas to understand how fast the earth as a whole can replenish it. We will never deplete the earth's energy. That is not a concern because we've got a perfect formula. So let's just leave it at that.
Thanks. I wonder if you can also help us imagine how to do this in Vermont more. The work that we've been doing so far is really about putting this idea on the table, getting the policy we need lined up at the State House, helping people understand what the potential is, that it's not just geothermal, but it's thermal exchange. And I think people are wondering, what do we do next? How does a town move forward with it? And I would say one thing would be to contact your legislators about H242 so that we can help access the capital we need to put this infrastructure in the ground. But what other advice might you have for a state like Vermont, where we have town centers that could probably do some wastewater and geothermal, and then we've got a lot of more rural places?
The best thing to do, and I think about it because we do so much of this, we have perhaps 12 to 15 cities, like villages or cities throughout the US that have taken advantage of the new Department of Energy. When I say new, it's about a year old, community heat pump program, which is now funded under the new IRA. So all you have to do to get this going is you have to get a city council or a state legislature that's interested in it. Then they get, kind of like Burrow-Happold did, they get a study for, kind of like Heat did with Burrow-Happold, they get a study done that shows the potential and where the hot spots are. Kind of what they did in, as many people know in Boston, is they did it like this. They showed their methane leakage, and that got the attention, and they were able to get attention that way and then say, we can put in these things. So the point is, somebody, whether it's a city, the state of Vermont, or just one community, has to get together with the county commissioners or the city commissioners and say, yeah, we would like to have a scoping study done to see what our potential is, whether it's at the state level or a local level. And when you do that, you get a company, an engineering company that's qualified in there, and they do that potential report and give it to you, and then you have something to bring to the state legislature. If they're not already believing it right now, that's what Heat had to do, and that's essentially what we had to do in New York. We had to do a little bit of front work, but once we brought that to the legislatures and the local cities and governments, they said, okay, we can act on this, especially with the precedents we have in other cities and states throughout the union.
And we do have really good incentives for municipalities and businesses to access right now in the
Yes.
IRA. I appreciate Mari Cordes, representative, who's the sponsor of our bill in Vermont, putting that in the chat. And our April 4th webinar is going to go into more detail on the IRA incentives with some national leaders who are working on that in Washington, D.C. But I'm wondering if you could tell us that we got this one really wonderful question. I wonder if you can tell us if you've had any significant aha moments in doing this work recently, or anything that's blown your mind.
The biggest aha moments are that while people talk a lot about doing these, taking the energy from data centers, and I found that there's a lot of talk about it, and it's not actually happening as much as we would like. So when you get in, my aha moment is to just make sure when we're pulled into a project that we identify the cooling dominant and the heating dominant locations. And that way we're able to, for example, like this is a data center and this is a greenhouse. It's very simple, but it's got a lot of waste heat and it can provide a lot of energy to greenhouse for year-round growing. So each and every situation is going to be a little different, but the aha moments are that no two cities are the same. We are finding that out left and right. So there's nothing really, it doesn't probably sound that profound, but every time we start a new project, we find a different angle. And we haven't had any projects shut down in a couple or 3 years because of lack of interest of legislators and local community groups. It's become a very easy sell for most communities and legislators to do this.
Yeah, they do seem to tick so many boxes with the benefits that are available through putting this infrastructure in the ground. So we just need to deal with getting it in the ground, doing the studies that are needed and that kind of thing.
That is the big ticket. You've got to, it's kind of like Field of Dreams. If you build it, they will come. We had one of our first thermal energy networks was in Clearwater, Florida, before we really started working nation and worldwide. And we were doing a geothermal central energy plant in Clearwater, and it was just for the government buildings. And so there were like 4 or 5 government buildings that it was going to go to. Then they offered that energy to private users. Not a single building turned down the opportunity to tie into that network because it was such a remarkable savings in energy and so much easier on maintenance. So it's kind of a Field of Dreams moment. If you build it, they will come. There really is no downside except getting over the hurdle of the fact that it's an infrastructure project.
Mm-hmm. And once you put it in the ground, I've heard people refer to it as you're buying all of your fuel up front.
Yes. If you look at this picture I have right here, they're unlike a natural gas network, which I love showing the comparison between a natural gas network and a geothermal or a thermal energy network. The natural gas is consumed where thermal energy is always local, like this. You can always get it out of the ground or other buildings. The infrastructure is the same. It's pipe in the ground. The utilization technology is a heat pump, which is roughly the size as a furnace, or a central heat pump, which is roughly the size of a boiler. And it's like such a no-brainer because out of this one, which is all local energy, you get both heating and cooling. Where in the natural gas network, which we put in 2.5 million miles of pipe nationwide in the 50s and 60s to more than 40 million customers. And that was a no-brainer. This is even more of a no-brainer.
Yeah, I guess history can teach us that we can do it again.
Yes, we
can. That's helpful. Well, we are just about at the top of the hour, and I want to thank everybody who showed up and put questions in the chat. I realize there are a ton of them, many of them quite specific. So I'll be going through the questions and seeing what we can add to our FAQ page, which hopefully is coming soon at Vermont Community Geothermal Alliance. I'll also take these questions back to our network action team that meets every 2 weeks, and we're focused on educating decision makers and also putting a project in Vermont, actually making that happen. So I really want to thank Jay, especially for your time today, for all of the stories that you told and all of the experience that you brought to us in Vermont. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I want to say, Rep Marie, I think Bill Nowak put this out there. NOCO Energy is a great example. They're a propane oil and delivery company, and we helped them do the initial study to start up their geothermal division a couple of years ago, just right at the beginning of COVID, and they're cranking. There is money to be made by energy companies doing this, and those that see it are going to have a wonderful transition. Those that don't are going to be kind of like, Yahoo, kind of just like they didn't get on the bandwagon. I don't know.
Oh, that Yahoo. Right.
Yeah,
Yeah,
probably a lot of us still use it, but still Google kind of passed them up.
And in Vermont, we might develop a model for doing this as a nonprofit, so that what money is made gets put back into the membership and the system and the community. So we'll see how we do with advancing that idea.
Thank you, Debbie. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Thanks, everybody. I hope that you can register for April 4th. And big thanks to Jay and also to Energy Action Network and Cara for helping us bring this to everybody today.
Yes. Thank you so much. Look forward to the next one.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.